we're featuring our friends and partners from Etermax. I'm going to give a quick overview of how Ask the Dev works. We'll start with brief introductions of our guests and shift to an informative discussion between our speakers. At the end, we'll close with some live Q&A. Be sure to stick around to the end though, we've got a special surprise. If you have any questions for the speakers today, submit them in the Q&A chat at any time during the session. We'll compile all your questions and address them to our speakers at the end of today's talk. There's a lot happening in the industry these days. I can't imagine us running out of content. All right, let's get things started. Today's Ask the Dev Live features hit mobile game developer Etermax. You likely remember their game Trivia Crack taking over the mobile world a few years ago. They were everywhere. In Etermax's own words, they combine technology and creativity to create communities and connect millions of users. It's a pleasure to welcome Etermax to today's session and partner with them on today's topic, creatives that drive your gaming product strategy. AppLovin shares a similar passion for mobile game development. For those of you not familiar with AppLovin, they fuel the growth of the world's most popular mobile games by empowering developers to deliver unique, handheld experiences to people all around the world. Let's dive into some introductions. Meet Chief Marketing Officer and Corporate Development Director at Etermax, Ignacio Ortiz. Ignacio was an executive director at JP Morgan before he joined Etermax in July 2017. In March 2018, he took over as CMO and leads all user acquisition, creative content, and product development teams. Next, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Jessica Dolan. Jessica has a background in animation and design. She joined AppLovin in 2015 and is currently a design manager for the in-house creative studio, SparkLabs. We're thrilled to have two industry experts. Thank you for joining us. With that said, I'll hand it over to Jessica.
Thanks, Jerome, and thank you to everyone joining us virtually. I'm really excited to talk about creatives and product strategy today. But before we dive in, Ignacio, could you share a little bit with us about Etermax and your role there?
Sure. So first off, thanks AppLovin for having me, and of course, anyone tuning in. It's an honor to be here. So, I mean, briefly about Etermax, I think Jerome did a good job, but we are, a 10-year-old, 400 people company that focuses mostly on social casual games. We have offices in Buenos Aires, in Montevideo, and Berlin. And, we aim to continue to make and hopefully learn from partners such as yourselves about how to make successful games in the future, be they turn-based, real-time, PvP. So we are definitely a company that is strong at its core in trivia, but then also figuring out a lot of new things which are going on in the industry.
Cool. Yeah, the industry is changing quite a bit. So
yeah.
On the SparkLabs team, we produce several creative types, including videos, graphics, playable ads. Which do you prefer when you're testing prototypes? And can these creatives influence game development?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think we spend a lot of time trying to answer exactly that. So I think the first thing I'd say has to do with, I don't think there's a specific right answer for the question. I think as you test things, the first thing that you need to do is figure out exactly what it is that you want to test. So you have to isolate that variable and make sure that you are only testing that. So in a sense, what I'm trying to say is the simpler the better, right? If you could test it through a static ad, then probably that works great. I mean, obviously it's cheap to make, it's cheap to run, the CPC should be low. And it's very hard to add noise through a static ad, right? You can really, really control the environment. Of course, not everything is that simple. So you quickly move into video, you move into playable, and that kind of sparks a whole new debate. Between video and playable, we do prefer playables. I think, even if they do have a higher CPC and a marginally higher CPI in our experience, we do like the fact that you can really get more insights. There's more data, like how do people interact with a playable. If you have the right playable setup, then probably that is actually very insightful and will help you a lot through the testing. But honestly, I mean, it also has to do with what a playable in itself is. We've tested a lot of platforms. Bringing the cost down, bringing production time down is crucial because you really want to test as much as possible. So if it takes a long time to set up the test, then that's also in detriment of the testing itself. So, we go back and forth. What I'm trying to say is that we tried to say, this is the definite answer. We do all test this way. And I don't think there is an answer to that question. I think we are trying to kind of come across. So when we do test aesthetics, we will do it this way. If we're testing the name, we'll do it this way. And we're slowly being able to create those buckets. But what type of format will change depending on what we're testing.
That's a great point, especially when you said, sometimes less is more with testing. With some of the really complex playable ads, it could be really hard to water down. Like, what about that ad makes it successful?
Yeah, and it's so hard to come to the wrong conclusion and then base a really big decision on data which is misleading because of whatever. So the fewer variables that are within the ad itself, probably the better. So if you could run a static and you can trust the answer, then that's probably the way to go. Oftentimes that's not the case, right? So
yeah. Can you walk us through a live example where creative results have influenced game development?
Yeah. Oh, and I apologize. I forgot to answer that part. And yes, I think that if you are working at scale, not only should they influence game development, but they increasingly, I think, almost determine what you develop and what you don't. So it's not just an influence, it's actually a core part of how you decide what you build. Specifically for us, when we are in a soft launch phase, the team that deals with the creative and the UA side of the soft launch phase typically creates 3 different types of creatives. One has to do with the brand, one has to do with the game mechanic itself, the gameplay, and one is we let them, and it's fun because they are good at it, kind of go wild and come up with sell a feature which doesn't already exist. And we do it because we like to see, is it cheaper? Is it easier to gain traction and so on. Earlier this year, well, they were doing one of those tests, and then of course that kind of just branches out into a million different variables, right? But earlier this year, we were testing a soft launch, a game that launched only recently, and we realized that this new feature that they had come up with, which wasn't really that far from the game itself, just went wild. It was the only thing that was gaining traction. It brought down costs by a significant amount, depending on country platform, but like 50% or more. So we actually got to a point where we sat down with the product team and we said, you know what, this is, everything else is identical to the game itself, but we are showing this and this is what people want to see. So they actually put it into the game right before we did the hard launch. So that's a very clear example of us influencing the game, the product itself. But to close out the story, I also want to be clear that it is to some extent a mixed bag, because while it did work, especially for UA purposes, what we didn't have as much were what happened to the KPIs later on. And this was a game that we were very confident in a lot of KPIs, and we knew how they would work and how people were going to interact. And the truth is that once we put the feature in, we realized that the people that were going into that specific feature, it was a single player feature and the rest of the game was social and PvP. So all of a sudden we noticed retention coming down in the day 7, day 14. So we didn't take it out, but now we're stuck, like, what do you do, right? We're working into how do we show it, because we still want to be able to buy using it, but then, so it definitely influences game production and features and so on. But it's not as simple as saying if you can buy cheaply, then this is guaranteed to work, because it never is.
Yeah, there's a lot of variables that go into it for sure. And that kind of brings me to my next question, which you started to answer a little bit, which is, what performance goals do you set up to help support those decisions?
We are spending a lot of time on that right now. So if you look at our company over the last year, we didn't make any launch in 2019. We were working on perfecting our prototyping, like basically identifying the tendencies that we wanted to work with, prototyping, finding the mechanics, and kind of getting to the soft launch phase. And I think we've done a great job at doing that. We're now working at, okay, so how do we know exactly what it is that we should launch? We have a lot of different KPIs, and I obviously look at, a lot of different conferences where people that have more experience than myself say, you know what, you need the 40% or 60% retention day one, and then this and then that. I've never found that it is such a clear-cut answer. So we have an amazing IPM. Retention day one is great. Retention day 7 isn't that much, and the conversion to buyers is slightly over what we typically see. you get to work on it. It's not such a clean-cut case. So we try not to, at least for now, this may change. We try not to say, we will only launch into production, or we will only soft launch, or we will only hard launch games with a defined set of KPIs. But I do think that the soft launch phase just gets longer. So once we have a game that we think we can work with, we spend a little bit of time on it, and we try to identify whether we think, 1 month, 2 months of work can get it to a position where we would hard launch it for sure. But there is no real hard answer, especially not unless you are very narrow in the types of game that you produce, where you kind of can easily decide whether it is easy or not to affect the game within those KPIs. Like, if our games are mostly ad-based, knowing whether we will be able to improve the conversion to bio within a new game is tough to say, because we don't have as much experience. But we're very good at telling you whether the CPMs are good and the amount of ads that they're watching and so on. So what I'm trying to say is, if you're out there and you're making games and you're reading up on all these people saying, I know for sure whether a game will work before I launch, hopefully they're right, and that exists. We just haven't gotten there yet.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I know we've all seen some, surprising games that have gotten really popular too. So it's definitely hard to predict sometimes.
Yeah. And it's frustrating when you feel that everyone else is able to do it. That's why I'm trying to say, like, it's fine. It's always a grayscale.
Yeah. Or when you see a game and it was really similar to an idea you had, like, oh, I could have made that.
That's terrible. But look, we also have Trivia Crack 1 and Trivia Crack 2, and they are very alike in many ways. And yet you look at a lot of the KPIs, not just the gameplay ones, but also how they work on the admon side, and they're extremely different. So even when you think that the two things are almost identical, they are in many ways, they're probably not.
Yeah. Going back to Etermax as a company, you lead several departments there. I know Jerome touched on this. Your departments are composed of business, marketers, designers, developers. Can you tell us what you've learned from building out that large team?
Yeah, and it's all within the marketing side and mostly user acquisition. So it's a very diverse set of people working within marketing, which is something that we try to do in general. So all our squads are basically, composed of people which come from different backgrounds, but specifically for marketing and user acquisition, I think I spent some time thinking about this recently, actually. So I'll say 3 things, which I think are my main takeaways after a couple of years doing this. The first is that user acquisition is always in crisis mode. Period. Like, you will always be struggling with, you're either not buying enough, you're not buying good enough, or your ROI isn't as high as it should be. And it's fine. I think you just work in steps. So once you can get to, you improve whatever, 20%, you had an amazing month, then you're at the limit, you're at the frontier of what you can do again. And you'll always be looking for more. And I think it's important to realize that, because there is a lot about how you manage the team and how, whether they're frustrated or whether they're the energy of the team is crucial. And if you don't make sure that they understand that, it's fine, we will always be, struggling with something which is very hard to achieve, which is perfection, like infinite amount of users at a perfect ROI, perfect quality. And so, as I grow the team, I spend a lot of time trying to communicate as much as I can about what's going on a strategic level, so that they can see that, yes, we will push you for more, but at the same time, it's fine. We understand that what you're doing is actually very tough and you're doing a good job. That's one. The second, I think, is follow the tech. I have a theory that, preaching to the, I can't remember the phrase, but essentially the choir, we work in tech, but I think tech is almost inevitable. If you think of something that you should be able to do with existing tech, then it will happen, and probably someone is either already doing it or slightly better at you doing that. So it's very easy to kind of say, so we're doing well and you don't want to change too much. And I think, unfortunately, you have to basically rethink things from scratch, maybe once a year, maybe once every 18 months, whatever, but kind of bring in tech. So right now, specifically within the tech side, I would think that we need to delegate all the optimization around campaigns. We work in so many countries and platforms and providers. It's impossible to think that I would have a team large enough to spend enough time looking at this. And by the way, our most popular time of the week is during the weekends, and I can't really expect my guys to be spending their weekends optimizing, campaigns and getting the data right. So delegation is a huge part of what we're working on. I want to make sure that as much as possible is delegated to be it, rule-based algorithms, machine learning, we'll figure it out. There's a lot going on right now in the space, and I think that is core to what we do. The second side is data. So when I think about the amount of data points that we look into right now, it has grown a huge amount over the past 2 years. I only expect that to continue. And the relevant thing there is not only making sure that you have the right data and have the right systems in place, but it's also that when you look at data, we kind of touched on this earlier, like data is really treacherous, right? There's confirmation bias going on. Did you set up the test right? Is the amount of the cohort that you created, is it big enough that you can really draw a conclusion? So learning how to work with data is a process, and it's a relatively newcomer to the way that, at least on the UA side, people are used to working. So I'm hiring a lot of people on the data side, and increasingly we just hired a chief data officer, and I told them, you can have whatever title you want, but I want you working next to me for maybe a few hours a day. We want to make sure that we do this right. Then the third side within the innovation side, I think, has to do with creative. So specific to what you do, of course. And the challenge there, I think, is getting people which are extremely good at the hard, the technical side of what they do, which is, amazing. But then also finding those that within that space are also good at working with data, that they want to log onto Tableau. They want to look at the metrics behind their creation. And it's kind of a guided creativity, which is not for everyone. And you have to be able to find people which say, I love this, I want to work this way, I love getting immediate feedback. And you can find artists that say, I think what I did is great and I'm putting it out there. And so that's also the challenge. And then the final thing I would touch on has to do with excess capacity and how, we're always mindful of cost and the lean team building. And not only because of churn, because inevitably people leave the company every now and then, and you want to make sure that that's not a big hiccup in the way you execute, but also because if you hire the right people and you have them motivated, then having spare time for them to do whatever they want actually means that they will just build cool things. They'll come back with insights, they'll tell you what you are not looking at, whereas if it's kind of a scripted thing that they do every day, it won't happen. So definitely, 10, 20% excess capacity, however you want to define it, but a little bit of that is crucial, I think.
That's a great point. And we definitely experienced that on the SparkLabs team too. One snippet that I wanted to highlight that I love that you said is that UA is always in crisis mode. And that's definitely true. Even as soon as you find a big win, you celebrate it for a little bit, but then you need to immediately focus on what the next win's going to be.
Oh yeah. And I always, sorry.
Oh no, go ahead.
I was going to say, I always struggle because you were mentioning the big wins. The other thing I hadn't thought about bringing it up right now, but I'm always extremely concerned when I go into a meeting with extremely good news, because there's always how come it didn't come sooner? So I have to make sure that what did we change? And then did we miss anything? Because there's nothing worse than saying, I scaled up this campaign because it's doing amazingly well. And then you look at the numbers and for whatever reason, it's not that great. So, fraud is huge. There's all these issues that you have to cross off the list. Best meetings are always the worst meetings. I prep much more for those.
Yeah, that's a good point. So specifically with, I know you did a great job of laying out how your team is built out, but specifically with the product team, I just wanted to ask, how does your creative team collaborate with them to be as successful as possible? I know that you did touch on that a little bit. I'm wondering if you have any tips you can share on that point specifically.
Yeah, there's been a lot of conversation around the integration between product and user acquisition. There's the Deconstructor blog out there. And so there's a bunch of things going on in the space. There's also a lot of conversation about the admon and UA ties and how close they should work together. I think like the first thing that comes to mind is, well, first off, has there ever been a time when we didn't really need to work together? I think this is just a reflection of how challenging the industry has become. It's just been, it is incredibly competitive. So as you know, we kind of need to bond together to make sure that we are as good as the rest and hopefully better. That said, which is just a signal of the times, right? But that said, yes, there are a lot of things that we do to hopefully kind of make that work, because it's not just a hierarchical issue. I mean, I can send the whole marketing team over to the CPO and that wouldn't really change much. So it's a matter of processes. But so right now, literally this week, the lead product owner from Trivia Crack, so our biggest product, is an intern at the marketing team. So let's call it a week off vacation from the product side, and he's coming to every single meeting. And the idea behind that is that he would learn about the way we do things and why, and hopefully we will eventually learn from him as well. And at the same time, that when we have an ask, he'll be able to translate that into something. He'll know where to put it within his backlog. So we're doing that, and we do that every now and then. We kind of bring people in for them to learn what we do. We created a team, which I kind of briefly touched on earlier, which is essentially a product team, but built by one of our top creatives from the UA team. We sent him over, so we had to sacrifice one of our valuable players, but to work with what we call Genesis, which is the team that focuses on the prototyping. And we also sent over a media buyer. So this is a hybrid team which works throughout the production phase, right? Because we do think that the sooner that we get involved, the better. We don't want to get to work when the product is a huge hit, because that's great, but then it's tougher. We need to work on it from the prototyping phase. We have cross OKRs. So, product teams have marketing KPIs, and they need to figure out how to work with us to make them work, and vice versa. And then when I joined the marketing team, I was very steadfast on telling my guys, hopefully not to frustrate them, but I would always say, like, we're not good enough as a UA team to tell the product team what to do. So there's always something that we can do better. Let's focus on that. Let's focus on that. Let's make sure not to mess too much with them. I kind of shift away from that now. So now what I'm trying to do is, let's understand how the product is built. Let's understand their backlog, and let's know where it is that we can kind of step in and say, you know what, for all these reasons, I really need you guys to set up these events on Firebase, because it is incredibly useful for our Google campaigns. And if they understand why and how we use the events, then they will put them in. So we're definitely blurring the line in many ways.
That makes sense, especially with how quickly developers are able to make games nowadays. A lot of stuff just has to happen real time.
Yeah. And definitely. I think the more that especially the larger companies are able to scale their production of new games, then this becomes increasingly relevant, for sure.
Yeah. So speaking of competitors in the market, it's getting more and more difficult now to be innovative in the industry. And what do you think are the greatest challenges that developers face, specifically with ideation and prototyping and development?
Yeah, so first off, I think there's a difference between the larger companies and the smaller studios, which I think is becoming increasingly evident, right? So when I think about our process, so I look at, the way our team is set up. Like I mentioned, last year we didn't launch anything because we had a team of like 40 people working on the modular platform on which our games are built. So that's a huge investment, both time-wise and money-wise, to make our production process more efficient. I look at the amount of money that we spend on having the right systems in place so that we can correctly measure pretty much everything. And that is a huge advantage. And it's extremely expensive. And it's not only the systems, but it's also the fact that since we are fortunate to have so many users on our existing games, and I mean, I'm talking to AppLovin, so you guys would know about this. the ability to be able to compare across games and figure out like what is the good IPM, what is a bad IPM, how should games be working in Turkey, what is a good CPM, should we optimize? Like all these things are things that we gain from both experience, traction, and then the investments that we make in the right systems. And I think, you know, both having a modular platform, having all the systems set up, having the user base so that you can test, having the money, because testing, you know, I was just mentioning there's a squad, a hybrid squad of user acquisition and product, which essentially all it does is perfect our ability to test different things at different stages of the production process. And that takes money, it takes time. And the extent to which small studios are able to pull this off, and then, by the way, get to a hard launch phase where you need to put a lot of money into user acquisition to hopefully kind of show up, because there's so many games out there that you can have the best game in the world and it will just not show up on the rankings. So, I mean, hopefully it does, by the way, but you run the risk of it not showing up, and you run the risk of having a viral success, which is never known. So like it could have been a viral success, which is never known. So all these things I think have made it so hard for smaller companies to kind of compete. And on the flip side, I think that that's also evident when you look at what the larger companies are doing, which is spending more time focusing on long-lasting established games, right? I mean, I think when I joined the industry, I think a lot of people thought about the gaming industry as a hit or miss, kind of one-hit wonder type industry where you kind of had a game, you milked it for as long as you could, and then it was done. Mm-hmm. And then you look at Candy Crush. Like there's all these titles which have been there for so long. I mean, Trivia Crack, but I don't want to. And they're still around, and they're successful, and they still bring the, you know, they have a loyal fan base, and people come and go. But there's a seasonality to it, but you can manage that if you manage the game. So I think, you know, companies are increasingly spending time on those titles because we can work around the brand. Whereas breaking into a genre and kind of establishing yourself as a newcomer, which is also successful, is very hard. And I think that's also evident in, and I'm kind of straying, but in the M&A that's going on in the business, right? Larger companies are buying companies with established titles because there's a lot of value in bringing on that franchise. So it's interesting. I wonder how it plays out in the future. It could be, you know, there was a huge hype might be the wrong word, but there was a huge growth around the hyper-casual part of the industry, and a lot of successful games were published through publishing agreements. So that kind of fixes some parts of the equation, right? Because you don't really have to be that good or have that much money at user acquisition, and someone is kind of validating the title for you because they decide to publish. So potentially, you know, studios start focusing on gameplays and they delegate the meta game to a publisher, which kind of provides that for them. We'll see, but there's definitely a lot going on, and it definitely, the more successful the successful companies are, the more attention that people are paying, fortunately for all of us, I think. But that also translates into there's more money, it becomes tougher, it is definitely a very competitive industry. Like we launched Trivia Crack in 2014, 2015, and at the time we launched it without doing any sort of user acquisition. And now it's, I mean, mind-boggling.
Yeah, it's crazy to think about. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I think that just points to the challenges, especially for smaller studios right now. And working with the right partners is a huge part of fixing that.
That's a great point. I think, you know, with the industry growing so much, there's so much opportunity, but there's also so much competition.
Yeah, for sure.
So that kind of brings me to my next question, which is, speaking of trends in the ad industry, last year we saw a huge trend, and you kind of mentioned this with hyper casual. We saw a huge trend of ads featuring mechanics that, or art styles that have nothing to do with the game.
Mm-hmm. I wonder who was the pioneer there.
Yeah. How do you see that affecting game prototyping, you know, in the next 6 to 12 months and creative evolution or creative production evolving alongside that?
Yeah, there's been a lot of debate around the issue, and I think we all learned a lot from it, honestly. I mean, I remember last year, pretty much every conference I attended kind of discussed whether it was right, whether it was misleading, whether the user experience was hurt, whether the brand was hurt. And then on the flip side, I think it was also interesting to hear about the extent to which when you run a successful game, you know, there is the risk of fatigue, right? You are, especially if Facebook or you guys, like as soon as you segment the audience that you would assume a title, Trivia Crack, for example, is supposed to target, then you will always be looking at the same crowd. And if you really want to grow, then maybe the right thing to do is kind of trick your provider into showing you to a very broad audience, right? And I think to some extent that's what was going on. And if it was successful, then, you know, it worked. And by all means, I think a lot of companies, ourselves included, kind of tried the waters, tested to see what works, what doesn't. When should we be using this? One of the things that we took out of it was we don't only look at the ROI or ROIC, but we also look at the quality score. So essentially, how does the quality of an acquired user compare to the quality of an organic user? And what I found was that obviously when we ran these campaigns, the quality score went down because we were misleading users to some extent. But at the same time, the ROI didn't necessarily go down. It may have gone up. So we're, at the end of the day, we're looking for volume, but we're also looking for ROI. So it's a strategy issue. I definitely think there is a lot of innovation in the near future for creatives because we're delegating so much that our only input to some extent is actually creative. So I'm curious to see what will happen. I don't exactly know what. The final thing I'll say about that is, for us, if nothing else, we definitely want to make sure that the creation of maintenance campaign creatives, so things that are ongoing in countries which may not be core, we think we can also delegate. So pick up on trends, work with a template, spit out the different formats, kind of upload that and be able to rotate creatives for certain markets, certain platforms, but without necessarily having to spend so much time, because, you know, our creative thinkers have to be innovating and not necessarily just doing maintenance. So yeah, a lot going on.
That is an interesting point, how you mentioned that, you know, sometimes the irrelevant ad types can still perform well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a strategy. So like, what are you looking for? So yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for the insight. And it looks like it's time for QA. So I'm going to hand it back over to Jerome.
Thanks, Jessica.
Thank you, Jerome.
Great. So it looks like we've got a bunch of questions from the audience. We'll work through these together.
Okay.
Start with the first one here. And this is, what's the benefit of cost per install model, CPI, over cost per impression model for the game developer?
Do you want me to take this, Jessica? Sorry, yeah.
Go for it.
Look, I think it's a good question. When I started working within the marketing team, I always used to say or think that, you know, we had gone from a CPM to a CPI, and eventually we're going to a CPA. And that was kind of like a historical timeline, and that was just the right way to go. And we spent a lot of time working on events and so on, and figuring that out. And I think to some extent it worked, right? But now, after a couple of years and looking at the industry today, increasingly, I think that, I mean, the obvious benefit is just CPI is easier, right? And CPA is even easier. If you're not cost aware, or if you can pull it off and get the right ROI, then that's amazing. But the truth is, you're also giving something up, and it's not just a commission issue, which of course is there. I mean, you're probably, if you're good at it, you can probably buy, you know, on a CPM basis, programmatic, and you'll do great. It's also about what you learn when you are that good at pulling it off. It's extremely sophisticated. It's extremely tough. We've tried to buy on a CPM basis, like just go into the auctions ourselves. And it's you know, there's a reason why you guys AppLovin are who you are, and there's a reason why it's tough to compete if we were to go ourselves and try to buy, you know, buy in an auction on our own. But whereas again, I used to think that the historical timeline was just trending in one direction. Now I'm starting to think that we should know how to buy programmatic. We should potentially be able to do direct deals every now and then. And as a company, we actually have 40 people this year working on building out our own ad tech infrastructure to further understand exactly what it is that goes into our buying and selling ads. Like, we are 85% ad-based in revenue model, and we need to understand what's going on. So I don't think, again, there's a right answer. I think if you can pull it off, then it's great. It's tough. It's, you know, you run the risk of it being expensive. So, you know, Facebook and Google will do, AppLovin will do an amazing job at segmenting the audiences and bringing the right users your way. If they can do that in a cost-effective way, then by all means do so. If you can go ahead and start buying direct and buying cheaper and in volume, then that's great. Be mindful of fraud, be mindful of KPIs. There's a lot of things to take into account.
Yeah, I think you make a good point. It's a question of risk management. Where do you want the risk to lie? You take on more as the developer or the buyer when it's upper funnel, CPM, but there are advantages there as well, right? And so it comes down to how confident are you in purchasing up at the impression? What sort of data do you have to inform that decision? So that's great to hear that you all are trying to find that additional margin there by, you know, investing in the tech.
Always.
Yeah. Here's a question. So UA is a global endeavor. How do you approach creative testing across multiple countries, languages, and contexts? Do you lead with certain geos and then have that inform others, or are there some markets that you know need to be approached uniquely?
It's a good question, and it's one that we unfortunately deal with more than we'd like, because we are not only, especially with the trivia games, it's not only that they're global, but we also have the content which has to be very localized. So we have content people picking up on trends in, you know, we run campaigns in Ukraine, in Russia, and it's tough to know what's going on there relative to Argentina. So there's a couple of things. First off, when we hard launch, we make sure that part of that budget goes into running worldwide campaigns. And so, for example, if there is some sort of economy within the game and we are running CPA campaigns guided towards buying, then if the prices are the same, then we could assume that to some extent, a worldwide campaign aiming at a certain CPA eventually, with, you know, because given that they're going to be spending the same amount, then we can kind of run a worldwide campaign and see where we are actually gaining traction. So we make sure that we test it in as broad a way as possible to see where we, a little bit at least, gain some traction in English for the most part. And then, yes, we do run certain campaigns where, for example, we once said, okay, so just for the fun of it, and because it's such a huge market that we weren't really big in, we said, let's try Russia, but let's not do this and just let's create an ad, start a campaign and see what happens. Let's do it from scratch. So we decided what was the content, like the first time user experience for the Russians. We hired a PR campaign, a PR manager to deal with the press. We did the whole thing and we just launched it in Russia all at once. And it's amazing because you're not only looking at the acquired user base and whether you can make it happen, but you're also looking at what the organic spillover is. So when you work with specific countries that you really want to target for whatever reason, and we were seeing that the organics were performing well in Russia, of course. And that's how we decided on Russia, aside from the size. But it's amazing the impact that you can have on both. So both the organic starts to increase, especially in a social game, and then, of course, the user acquisition was working. So we do both. It's a very broad approach, and then there's also the sniper thing where we kind of pick a region, a country, and spend a lot of time working on it. Those are extremely expensive efforts, so, you know, far and in between.
Yeah, you mentioned those broad campaigns. You collect some of the data, and then from there, it gives you insights. You have to be able to adapt.
Yeah.
So we have a iOS 14 question, and it'll be a more specific one. How do you see creative testing and iteration potentially changing with iOS 14?
That's a good question, which I'm also curious to hear, Jessica, your thoughts, if you could later on, because you guys will have a good approach. We've obviously spent a lot of time looking at iOS 14 and the impact that it will have on the industry. Look, I think the jury's still out in all senses. So not only in how we will be able to acquire going forward, but of course that spills into what will happen on the creative side. If it is tougher to target, then you would think that niche creatives start making less sense because they target a narrower audience, which is going to be more difficult to affect, especially like outside of Facebook. Well, and again, depending, like there's so much going on in this space right now. So I would think that that's probably one thing that potentially we would have to look into. So making, especially for us, to give you context, within the trivia space, we also have trivia topics, so we can have, history questions, math questions, whatever, 4th of July questions recently. So if we're doing something as narrow as that, that is only useful as long as you can really target your audience afterwards. If we're not doing that, then we might as well just kind of look at something much, much broader. And again, I'm not as pessimistic as a lot of other people. I think we'll survive. So we'll just see how it pans out.
Yeah, I took the question more if you could think how important is post-install tracking towards creative performance, right? You still have your clicks and your impressions. So it might come down to that question, like, do you base everything off of click-through rate and IPM, or are you actually putting more of the weight downstream, in which case then iOS 14, I can see there being a lot of problems. So I tend to lead more on the upper funnel. Obviously, you don't want to be very far away from your game, like the hyper casual ads you were mentioning, but hey, they work.
Yeah, look, that's a good point, and it's something which we actually had to deal with recently on account of the changes that Facebook was posting back on the VTA front, especially. So we were struggling to understand the extent to which we would trust VTA and whether we would essentially continue running campaigns with a VTA type of attribution. And this all comes back to what you were saying, right? Do we have enough information on a postback to figure out whether we trust the traffic, whether we like the traffic? Like you mentioned, we do measure creatives on post-install KPIs. Look, the only thing I would add here is we are very much, especially right now, obsessed with the impact that this specifically will have on the industry. And especially for companies such as ours, where we monetize through ads historically, we haven't really had a way of knowing a user level CPM in basically forever, right? So we've always been looking at average CPMs on the ad mon side, and we've been able to make it work. If all CPMs are now equal because we don't have enough post-install data to kind of know what's what, then maybe it makes us more efficient, because at the end of the day, our LTVs are based off of the average CPMs that we're getting back from the ad side. So again, I don't know, but if we're optimizing through true information, because the CPMs actually do become equal because we're not really segmenting as much as we used to, then maybe it works for the better. I don't know. It's something I spend a lot of time on, and honestly, it's so hard to say for sure what's going on, what will happen.
You mentioned earlier in the talk that playables were very important, but they may be a little bit more expensive. So how does your HTML strategy compare to video, and how has this changed over time?
Well, honestly, the playable strategy changes a lot depending on how we approach the production. So we've tested a bunch of strategies to outsource production with mixed reviews. We've tried building them ourselves, but that's also it takes up a lot of time. So we're now at a point where we've rebuilt a team to do that. Hopefully it works. If you don't, okay, so I'll take a step back. ROI is king, right? So they are more expensive, but if they work, be it because someone else makes them, we make them, whatever it is, if they work, then we'll pay for them, and that's great, and we'll build them out. So we definitely do them. In our case, we've always been more successful with video. So we run a lot of video campaigns and they work great. I think, Playable is something which would probably increase in the near future, but for now, it's something which carries more weight on the testing of prototypes and new games and so on than it does in maybe existing like games and ongoing campaigns.
All right, we're coming up on time, so this will be the last question.
Okay.
So how does Etermax split creative process between quantity? So that's testing, exploration, very rapid testing, and then quality, scaling things that are proven that work up. And that could be your team organization or how you can kind of invest marketing dollars.
Right. So, well, of course, both things have to happen always at the same time, because otherwise, by the time the ad fatigue kicks in for whatever has been working, if you don't already know what you have to put in place, then you're done. So what we do is we have some ad sets which compete. So we kind of run a test campaign where we're always testing new ads to see what new things we come up with, which makes sense, and we kind of iterate there. And once we have a clear winner, that is what will feed into the more into the larger ongoing campaigns, which we invest more money with. So we kind of run those two at the same time. And of course, there's also the issue of what platform you use. So do you always test with the same provider? Do you test with different providers? Some providers, of course, create their own ads. So it's interesting to see what they're up to and kind of see if we can learn from them, or we even learn from you guys. Like Jessica does a great job. We make sure we know what she's up to and try to see if she does the testing for us.
Yeah,
Ignacio.
one thing I'll add on to that. Oh,
Yeah.
sorry, Jerome. Just on the creative side, adding on to Ignacio's point, we're constantly, refreshing and just evaluating our creatives too, keeping up with the trends, and there's always something new that we could be doing. So, yeah.
Yeah, because there's also the issue of, well, I don't know, going forward, like how do other formats, completely new formats, kick in? I listen to a lot of podcasts. I've started hearing ads for games on podcasts. I'm curious to see how they pull that off, but that's interesting. That's something that we don't currently do, but maybe it works. And we're in smart speaker, so yeah, we'll see.
All right, everyone, thanks so much. Thanks, Ignacio and Jessica. Really appreciate the insights today. We're at our time limit. Just want to note, so in a few moments, everyone here is going to be receiving a poll to provide feedback on today's session. We're going to pick 2 people who participated in the poll and ship a pair of AirPods to their door, so please answer candidly. I hope you enjoyed our talk today, and we look forward to hearing your valuable feedback.
Thank you so much. It's been great being here.
Thank you. If you enjoyed today's talk, visit applovin.com/events for all the info and links to register for any upcoming sessions and to see any of our past recordings. Once again, thanks again, Ignacio and Jessica, and can't wait to see you all again on the next episode.